Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ISE EEI and Built Environment sectoral updates. Hope you are all keeping safe, all things considered. My name is Anna, and I'm an event executive here at the ISE, and I'll be helping our speaker Tristram to facilitate today's webinar. So I'll just give you a little bit of a background into how these webinars work. Very shortly, I'll be handing over to Tristram Hooley, our Chief Research Officer, who will be delivering this webinar and look at the most recent ISE data relevant to the EEI and Built Environment sector. Tristram will take us through findings from our mid-season pulse survey, the development survey, and the most recent coronavirus survey. We will then have a Q&A session, and we'll offer you the opportunity to ask questions and input your perspective. So if you do have a question, please use the question box on your right-hand side of your control panel. I will keep an eye on those, and we will cover them at the end of the session. We also record all our webinars, so this webinar will be online afterwards. Therefore, if you want to recap on anything you've heard today, or there is anything that you think other members of your team would be interested in, then you can pass them the link after and they can view this recording as well. Okay, so what I would like to do now is to hand over to Tristram, who's going to update us on the latest ISE surveys. Tristram, over to you.
Hi there, really good to be able to speak to you. So I'm going to be talking today about various different surveys that we've done over the last 3 and a bit months, which are looking at various aspects of the early careers market. But particularly I'm going to try and focus in on data where I have it, which looks at 2 of our sectors. So the first one is the engineering, energy and industry sector, and the second one is the built environment. And those sectors have a number of features in common, and so we tend to deal with them together. So what I'm going to cover is a little bit about the labour market outlook at the start of the year. I'm then going to move on to look using largely our development survey to look at development, and then I'm going to talk a bit about COVID-19. So let's start with where we were at the beginning of the year. So we surveyed a whole bunch of firms at the beginning of the year, and we said, how's your graduate recruitment and non-graduate recruitment going? And this, out of all of the people we surveyed, it was, I think, about 120, something like that, responses that we had for different firms. Actually, I think it was rather higher, actually. I think it was up past 150, actually. We said, how many of you are recruiting graduates? And the answer was basically all of those firms were recruiting graduates. And how many of you are recruiting non-graduates? And so we use this term non-graduates to describe apprentices, school leaver programs, other entry-level sort of recruitment programs. And about 3/4, so about 75% were recruiting at that level. So one of the things we're interested in this period, if you cast your mind back, you may remember there was quite a big deal at the time, which was called Brexit. It seems perhaps a lot less important now than it did at the time, but we were interested in whether Brexit was leading firms to make geographical changes. And so we wanted to look at how many firms were moving new staff into the UK, so new numbers, entry-level numbers into the UK. And overall, about 4% of firms said that they were planning to do that. And how many were moving out of the UK? So about 11% of firms were doing that. So this starts to create a bit of a picture that we were a little bit worried about at the time, because it suggested that people were moving out of the UK, and we were worried that that might be linked to Brexit. We then were also interested in how did that play out in London, because sort of another but not entirely unrelated sort of pattern that we've seen is of firms moving out of London and into the regions. So we found that about 9% of firms were moving staff into London, but overall about 21% of firms were moving staff out of London. So we started to see a bit of a pattern of some firms moving out of the UK, some firms moving out of London, So how does this play out for the sectors that we're looking at? Well, in the built environment, about 12% of built environment firms are moving staff into the UK, but none of the engineering, energy and industry, the EEI ones, were doing that. We then look at who's moving out. About 31% of the built environment firms were moving staff out of the UK, but only 3% of the EEI firms. So that's quite interesting because it suggests that the EEI firms are a bit more locked down, a bit more kind of geographically specific. When we look at London, we again see a similar pattern really here. So more moving out than moving in, but particularly with the EEI, much less likely to be sort of geographically mobile, that industry. It's probably to do with the amount of plant that kind of industry has. So in terms of how was the overall pattern of recruitment? Well, I've broken it down by different sectors and particularly by the built environment and the engineering, energy and industry sectors. And this relates to, we've got a dashboard that we offer which allows you to interact with this data a little bit. But what we can see here is that in general, the two sectors that we're focused on, they were increasing the number of non-graduates, but they were decreasing the number of graduates. Now that wasn't the pattern right across the market, but it is an important thing to pick up for these sectors. So if we look across the whole market, what we can see is that the whole market was forecast to grow for graduates by about 3% and for non-graduates by about 2%. I've also reported here some figures from our previous recruitment survey, which tell us that in general, employers don't fill all the vacancies that they're intending to recruit to. And so what that looked like was that in general, firms were anticipating that they would recruit about the same this year as they did last year. So, you know, and that was our kind of prediction really, was that we were looking at a flat market, and that was remarkable because we've had quite a few years when the market's grown. So if anything unexpected was to happen, it's possible that the market might turn down. We got a lot of commentary on this in various newspapers at the time, this survey, and it tended to focus on this sense that the employment market was stagnating. And I decided then to write an article in response to this in Luminate, where I tried to kind of, I suppose, balance out some of the more sensational things that we were getting in the newspaper. So my prediction was that graduate employers, and this was specifically relating to the graduate side, but the non-graduate side is really much the same. Graduate employers will continue to be cautious throughout the rest of the recruitment season. By the end of the year, they will have revised down their recruitment targets and recruited around the same number or slightly fewer graduates than last year. If the economy develops as predicted, we'll then see modest growth next year. If Brexit goes badly or there is a global economic shock, all bets are off. And as we'll come back to in a little bit, it proved to be the case that all bets were indeed off. So let's look on about development. So one of the other surveys that we do is around development. So we're interested in how do firms actually manage the hires that they recruit once they've recruited them. So while most of our data tends to focus on recruitment, this focuses on how are people actually managed once they're in firms. So this breaks down the respondents to that survey. I think again we had around about 120 responses to the survey. But when we look at the actual numbers of early career hires that relates to, we can see that that it differs a little bit. So retail and fast-moving consumer goods and built environment are overemphasized in terms of the number of firms because they're tending to hire smaller numbers than the built environment and energy, engineering and industry are tending to hire smaller numbers than the number of firms who are responding. So if you look at the comparison there, so actually we've got a slightly less in both of those. There we go. So The first thing that people were interested in is what is the size of a typical recruitment team, and we tried to break that down a bit. So what we've done here is create a picture of, and so this is for every person that you recruit, how many learning and development professionals are you going to need in your firm? And what we found was that the average, the typical, in fact, ratio, we used the median, the typical ratio was that for every learning and development professional you will have 7 graduates each year and 3 non-graduates. And then you've obviously got to multiply that by the number of years that the program runs for. And as we'll look at in a second, most of those programs are running for 2 years. So what that gives you is a ratio of something like 1 to 20. So learning and development professionals are usually responsible for around about, on a typical learning and development professional would be responsible for around about 20 hires in their learning and development. If we look at how that differs in the sectors, it's not actually radically different. So the built environment and EEI are both helping sit around an average of 6 graduates a year, 6 non-graduates in built environment and 4 in EEI. So our typical team size is about 6 people, slightly smaller in the built environment. And most of those firms are also using external contractors to support their core staff. And another element of the sort of team that does the development is line managers. And the overwhelming majority of these firms, both in general and across these 2 sectors, are offering training for their line managers to help them to support. So there's quite a bit of detail in some of the statistics here. It's in the report, but we'll also make these slides available if you want after the session. We then try to quantify how much, for every new hire, how much is being spent on their learning and development. And we came up with a figure of, on average, across the piece, we've got around about 5,000 or 6,000, so almost £6,000 across the 2 years of an average program is being spent on each hire to give them development. That was rather less in the built environment, so around about £4,000, and rather more in engineering, energy and industry, around about 9,000. Now, I'm not exactly sure why that figure was so much higher. I wonder whether it's to do with particular forms of professional accreditation that might have a particular price tag attached to them. So this gives us some idea about how much you should be spending during their program on each new person that you hire. We then looked at how apprenticeships break down. We're doing a lot of work on apprenticeships recently, and we wanted to see what proportion of firms were recruiting apprenticeships at different levels. And we can see there's a pretty high proportion of apprenticeships being recruited at all levels. That's really what I take away from that. There's a concentration at level 3, when a lot of firms are recruiting a lot of level 3 or running a lot of level 3 apprenticeships. And it's also worth noting that 58% of firms are developing apprentices to do work that previously would have been done by graduates. And this is something that we're particularly interested in the context of a recession, which sadly it looks like we're now entering, is whether firms actually turn down their graduate recruitment for the rather cheaper apprenticeship recruitment as a way of managing their costs. If we look at the built environment and EEI sectors, we can see that the pattern is a little different. We've got quite a lot of detail in this figure, but again, what we can see is that across the different levels, firms in both sectors are using all the levels of the apprenticeships, with particularly strong concentrations in level 2, 3, and 4. So probably the kind of center of gravity is a little bit lower than in general here, but this gives you the idea of the data. And 80% of built environment firms are interested in using apprenticeships to do work that was previously done by graduates, in comparison to only 43% of the EEI firms. So in terms of graduate programs, they typically run for 2 years. That was true across the sectors. And on average, they're including about 19 days of training a year, slightly lower in both of the sectors we're focusing on. And the average induction program is lasting for 6 days, slightly lower in built environment. That gives you an idea of the shape of a sort of typical graduate recruitment program. What are they doing in those programs? Well, we've got a range of different approaches that people are using: classroom learning, online learning, and so on. So we've got some common approaches that are being deployed, quite similar between graduates and non-graduates. But what's perhaps more interesting is what employers think is most effective. And so we've got areas like classroom learning, experiential learning, mentoring, and so on as being seen as some of the most effective ways to train your staff. We also looked at what skills employers are looking for, and looking at the difference between graduates and non-graduates. And what we can see is that there are some areas where this is the skills that they're particularly looking for, some areas where they're looking for more from non-graduates than from graduates. I think these are more kind of remedial areas where people would be concerned that non-graduates might not be quite up to scratch, so dressing appropriately, IT skills, and so on. But in every other aspect, they're more demanding. Employers are more demanding of what they look for from graduates than they are from non-graduates. If we then look at what they think that students actually lack, we can again see some interesting patterns emerging here. So there are a number of areas where non-graduates are seen as much more likely to lack those skills than graduates: commercial awareness, career management, self-awareness, then the dressing appropriately, numeracy, and teamwork, although they're fairly low down at the bottom. So these are areas that where graduates have got a clear advantage over non-graduates. But 88% agreed that students with work experience arrived with better skills. So although the qualification level is important, actually work experience is also very, very important. And that's really emphasized by the fact that while the overwhelming majority liked students with more work experience, a pretty small minority cared about postgraduate degrees. And then we've got some information about the kind of skills that employers are developing. And again, we get some important differences between graduates and non-graduates. So they're much more likely to be developing negotiation, influencing skills, leadership, dealing with conflict, managing up, and so on in graduates than they are in non-graduates. And this, I think, says something about how employers see the unique components, unique value of graduates. But there are some areas where they're more likely to be developing the skills of non-graduates, so staying positive, dressing appropriately, numeracy, and so on. And so these are areas where, again, it's this kind of remedial areas where they're concerned that non-graduates are not very good at it, and so whereas the graduates tend not to need the support here. Moving on, we'll have a little bit of a look at retention. And what we can see is that, as we've identified, while graduates slightly, not dramatically, slightly outperform non-graduates on skill levels generally, where they get outperformed on definitely by non-graduates is on loyalty. So retention, non-graduates are more likely to stay. So after 5 years, almost 70% of your non-graduates will still be in your firm, whereas it's sort of in the mid to high 50% for graduates, which is still, I think, a relatively high level of retention, but still less. If we break that down by sector, we can see that there aren't really radical differences in terms of the sectors, in terms of levels of retention, but actually energy, engineering, and industry is scoring pretty high. People are pretty loyal to that sector. Built environment, not quite so much. So there's some issues there, but yeah, broadly, most of the sectors are clustered in a similar place. The same is really true for non-graduates. We've got a slightly strange outlier in the legal sector, which I'm a little bit cautious about that figure, but in general, we can see similar patterns. In this sector, built environment is coming out top, and energy, engineering, and industry a bit lower down. So there are some issues again with the retention of graduates and non-graduates, and these might give you some figures to benchmark yourself against. So firms also report that there are some types of hires that are more difficult to retain. Women, BAME hires, people with mental health issues are the main ones that people raised, and that's something that we're a little concerned about and things that we are keen to look into a bit more. We also have got some insights as to why people leave, and generally they're quite career related reasons. So people are leaving to change career or to move to another company, or because they're dissatisfied with the progression in that firm. Actually, the pay then only becomes important. It's only the fourth kind of ranked one down, and so it's only only a quarter of firms are identifying that as one of the most important reasons. And if we look at the average pay increase in the first 3 years at the firm, we can see probably why that is, in that generally this cohort of graduates and non-graduates are getting pretty substantial pay increases over their first 3 years, and so it's perhaps unsurprising that not that many of them are dissatisfied with their pay. We break that down into a bit more detail. We've got some detailed figures here, which again are in the report, that look at your sectors in detail. So, but across the board, we're seeing substantial increases for both graduates and non-graduates over the first 3 years of employment. So that gives you a little bit about the kind of development, management, and so on of staff, early career staff. And we're now going to say a little bit about the COVID-19 situation, because we've been doing quite a lot of research on this. So if we look at the number of cases of COVID-19 that we've seen in the UK over the last now almost 4 months. Well, no, this only goes back actually to the beginning of February, but it sort of shows when it really first started to appear in the UK. What we've then conducted a couple of surveys. So the first survey we conducted was an employer survey, and as you can see, that really was right at the beginning of this outbreak. It was really at the point at which we were just starting to see that COVID-19 was going to be a big deal for the British economy. So I'm going to present some results. I think they're still very interesting results. They give us some really strong clues about where employers are going, but they are a bit limited by the fact that they were done so early. We then conducted a survey of suppliers much more recently, but as you can see, even then, the number of cases was still much lower than it is now. So this is a very fast-moving situation, and so it's important that we bear that in mind. But let's start with some of our data from our employer survey. So what we're seeing is employers are changing the way that they're working quite substantially. This was before the lockdown, but even before the lockdown had happened, we'd seen most people kind of starting to shift their staff to home, to conduct meetings online, to stop traveling, and so on. More sort of appertaining to the recruitment issue is this is a number of key processes that employers are doing, which they're doing normally doing in a face-to-face way, and we're then seeing how they're breaking these things down and whether they're either not changing them, whether they're delivering them online, reducing them, or cancelling them. And broadly, the pattern here is that sort of attraction and marketing activities, so visits to universities, that kind of thing, were basically being cancelled. And obviously, since this survey was done, universities have largely shut down face-to-face teaching, and so those things are pretty much cancelled. But things where we had assessment centres, interviews, selection processes, they've been shifted online. So that's an important kind of distinction, is that while employers have stopped actively going out and doing physical things to recruit people, they have carried on doing recruitment and selection activities by moving them online. Talking a bit more about the development programs, there's a bit more of a mixed picture here, but generally people are pretty loath to cancel their development programs altogether, and so they've been looking at other ways to deliver them, usually by changing them to deliver them online again. Overall, we asked how we think your hiring numbers will be shifted and changed by the COVID-19 situation, and in general, employers were saying that they're carrying on as planned, but there was a substantial number who were saying that they were going to decrease. Generally slightly decrease rather than substantially decrease, but around about a quarter of employers, maybe to moving up to about a third of employers when we add in the substantially decreased numbers, start to say, well, actually, we're going to decrease the number of people recruiting this year. So that gives us a bit of a sense that the labour market seems to be shrinking, but not dramatically so. Moving on to our supplier survey, we asked suppliers, how's it going for you? Are you finding the demand for your services is going up or down? And the balance, again, was down, but not dramatically so. So suppliers are still trading, they're still able to sell their services to employers and to universities. So just to explain briefly what we mean by suppliers in ISE terms, suppliers are various forms of labour market intermediary. They're people who sit between education and employment and help the early careers labour market to work effectively. So that might include recruitment companies, it might include marketing companies, branding companies, a whole range of different organisations that help the early careers labour market to move smoothly. And what this is interesting, both because it's interesting to see how that part of the labour market is going, or that part of the market is moving, but it's also gives us some indication, given that this data is more recent, it gives us some indication of how the whole labour market is holding up. And again, we have this pattern of decrease, but not collapse. So what are they offering? What are these suppliers offering? Well, generally, what they're offering is forms of services that are about moving parts of your recruitment and development provision online. That's the biggest kind of cluster of activities that suppliers are offering, particularly in this period. And that gives us a really good indication of what employers are doing, how they're responding to this situation. However, there are also suppliers offering consultancy, branding, advice, that kind of things, and some offering of replacement capacity where firms have actually found that they've had too many people off sick. We also asked our suppliers to give us an indication of how they thought the labour market was going. It's kind of similar to the picture that we saw a few weeks earlier, a couple of weeks earlier from the employers. A little bit more negative, a little bit more likely to say, actually, overall, the labour market's in decrease. Where it starts to be particularly concerning is around the area of interns and placement students, where our suppliers are not very optimistic at all and see there being a substantial decrease in numbers. But for other types of hires, so ordinary graduate and non-graduate hires, they're saying, yes, there's going to be less, but not a collapse. So just to finish up, I'm just going to kind of alert you to a piece of work that we've been doing. We've been producing a series of bulletins each week on the COVID-19 situation. And in those bulletins, we've been trying to sort of draw together some of the big insights that are coming from, not just from our research, but from more widely. So you can access that through our news pages. But there's some data that I thought is worth putting in front of you. So this is data from EMSI, which is a labour market data analysis company. They find that there's been a massive drop in online job postings since the virus has taken off. So what we're seeing is a steady and increasing reduction in the number of jobs that are available. So that tells us quite a lot about what's happening in the labour market, that we're seeing the labour market really slow down in a way that we perhaps haven't seen before. We also have started to see some very clear indications from the stock market and from various kinds of international bodies that do predictions on the economy, and of course from various researchers and academic economists. Generally, the picture is not particularly positive. People are quite concerned about the way the economy is going. It's pretty certain that we're moving into recession. The question is really how long it will take us to get out of that recession. So one of the things that we do every week in our bulletins is we try and give employer insights. And so I've just drawn out the insights from last week's bulletin, because I think it's useful to see the sort of things that we're hearing very currently from employers. So these were the things that employers were talking about last week. They were talking about how recruitment processes were moving online, how they were managing the end of placement students this year who they've had on placement, but who in many cases they've had to furlough or end their placement early. They were talking about cancelling summer internships or finding alternate ways to deliver those internships. A few were also talking about where their graduates were completing programs, so perhaps after 2 years of being on a graduate program, and finding that there may not be enough jobs for them and trying to figure out how we're going to manage that. And then employers are starting to get very concerned about their reputation in relation to some of these negative impacts that they're hearing, that they're having to kind of say. So they're going to have to potentially reduce the number of people they hire. Some may end up reneging on offers and so on. And so a lot of firms are talking a lot about how we're going to try and manage the reputational damage. So there's some sort of examples of some of the insights. So to summarize, really, I think we're still very much at the beginning of this crisis. In the short term, we're seeing face-to-face attraction activity ceasing, selection moving online, summer internships largely ceasing or being turned down. And as insights about numbers for September are still rather unclear. The reduction is very likely, however, but it's not clear that it's going to be a collapse. It's more likely to be turned down slightly. But much will depend on how long restrictions stay in place. And longer term, there is a wider economic downturn, which I think is probably now not just possible, but certain. And the question is, what will be the impact on that on hiring numbers this year, but also next year as well. So the implications, I think, is that COVID-19 is driving change. Firms are shifting online, and we're seeing new ways of recruitment emerging. There's quite an impending crisis for young people entering the workforce this year and possibly next year. There's a very big danger of recession, and the government is acting, but it's likely to need to do more as we move forwards. So getting to the end now, I will flag that we have a new employer survey out. We're trying to update the survey results that we had earlier this, well, back last month now. It's only a month ago, but as we saw at the beginning, these have become quite out of date quite quickly. So we're now running a new survey. We'll have more data from that in early May, I think. So if you are an employer, then please go to our website and complete that survey. And if you want more information, go to our publications pages. In fact, our website is absolutely full of information about all of these issues, all things student recruitment and development, but we've also recently launched a COVID hub. And these are my contact details if you want to get in touch with me. But I'm very happy to answer a few questions now if people have got any.
Thank you, Tristram. Really useful content. I've got one question, but so just to remind everyone that you can type in your questions into the question box, which is located on your in your control panel on the right-hand side. So one of the questions which Charlie asked when you were covering the first survey is, do the property consultancies such as Savills, Knight Frank, JLL take part in this survey, or is it mainly construction, civil engineering companies?
So in terms of built environment, it's a bit of a mix. It's probably is dominated more by construction and civil engineering type firms, but there are a number of those of more kind of management type firms there. The built environment sector is not a very big one, so we haven't got loads of responses, and that's why we're not able to split it out any further, because we start getting down to very small numbers. But as you know, I mean, what you're gesturing towards, I suppose, is that there probably are some differences in patterns in those kinds of things between different types of firms within sectors, which undoubtedly is true.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Michael asked about the if we're going to have a new survey, but you already answered that at the very end of your session. So
yeah,
that's
so
covered.
please do complete that survey. If you're an employer, it's really helpful if you can complete it. It will be open this week and next week, and then we will have a kind of final day on what I think is Monday, the 4th of May. So that's the kind of plan for the survey, and then we will analyse it that week and hopefully come out to you with more information based on that survey the following week. But we think that firms are now in a position where they're starting to get a bit more of a sense of how they're going to manage this over the longer term.
Tristram, we've got a question from Lee. Are you able to survey the same employers each time in order to establish more sectoral data specific to EEI and built environment?
So we'll go out to essentially the same audits. I mean, we've opened these surveys out to a wider group than we normally go out to. So, but the core of it is ISE members, and so that gives us kind of around 300 firms that are pretty similar actually in terms of the way they handle things, and pretty standard from one year to the next. So that gives us quite a lot of consistency in what we're doing. But we are opening this up, and one of the things that we're particularly interested in doing in this survey, and one of the reasons why we've partnered with ADCAS on the survey that we're doing at the moment, is trying to build a bit more insight into small and medium-sized enterprises who aren't particularly well represented in the ISE membership. So yeah, so that's how the sample will be different. I mean, essentially, the more responses we have, the better the quality of the data, the better insights that we can offer for each sector, the more capability we've got of cutting it down and looking at things like, you know, different size firms within different industries. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, in my ideal world, I would get thousands of responses to these surveys, but we don't tend to get that. So please do forward it on to anyone who you think might be interested in this.
Thank you, Tristram. Michael, again, he's sort of commenting, I guess. Can I offer to get in touch with anyone from the built environment property sector who wants to get more involved in the sector group? I'm happy for ISE to share my contact details. Thank you, Michael. So if any one of you would like to get involved, then drop me an email or Tristram an email. My email is Anna, ANNA, @ise.org.uk. And Tristram is Tristram @ise.org.uk. I can do it also via our webpage. Can I get slides anywhere? Yes, Stacey. So this is the session is being recorded and everything will be published on ISE webpage. If you go to events, webinars, all our past webinars are listed there, and you can view those recordings, and also all our upcoming webinars are listed there as well. So thank you, everyone. Do we have any other questions to cover? May I just stress as well that we are producing really useful content as well now in forms of webinars. So just to encourage you to check the ISE website on a regular basis. If you go to events and calendar, everything is listed there. I think it's really worth checking it if you're looking for relevant content now, especially to the current situation of COVID-19. Well, I think we covered all the questions. I can't see anything else coming up, but if you do have any additional questions or any comments, you can always follow up with Tristram directly. He's always very happy to reply or have a chat with you. Yeah, so thank you everyone for your time today, and thank you Tristram for a great session again. And everybody, please stay safe and have a great afternoon.